All right, this is Preventing Violence Educational, Part 4. Picking up where I left off here. Feelings of shame and self-contempt are often overlooked by others because the people who experience them do their best to conceal such feelings behind a defensive mask of bravado and boasting. There is nothing more shameful than to feel ashamed. It reveals that a person has something to feel ashamed about. Why are these feelings of shame and self-contempt so bottomless, chronic, and almost ineradicable to the most violent men? Because in the men I knew, they had been subjected to a degree of child abuse that was off the scale of anything I had previously thought of describing with that term. Many had been beaten nearly to death, raped repeatedly or prostituted, or neglected to a life-threatening degree by parents too disabled themselves to care for their child. And of those who had not experienced those extremes of physical abuse or neglect, my colleagues and I found that they had experienced a degree of emotional abuse that had been just as damaging, being focused on as the parent's emotional whipping boy, in which they served as the scapegoat for whatever feelings of shame and humiliation their parents had suffered, and then attempted to rid themselves of by transferring them onto their child, by subjecting him to systematic and chronic shaming and humiliation, taunting, and ridicule. That references Fraser Aggression, 1974. On the other hand, everyone gets shamed or slighted at one time or another, yet most people never commit a serious act of violence. In that respect, shaming is to violence as the tubercle bacillus is to tuberculosis, a necessary but not a sufficient cause. Even the most violent people are not violent most of the time. Before people will resort to violence, and it is always a last resort, several further preconditions need to be in place. One is that they have not yet developed the capacity for the feelings that prevent most of us from behaving violently, no matter how much shame, disrespect, dishonor, or insult we are subjected to, such as guilt and remorse over hurting someone else, empathy, love, and concern for others, and even the rational, self-interested fear of the retribution that violent behavior provokes from others. A second precondition is that enormously increases the likelihood that people respond to feelings of shame by means of violence is that they do not perceive themselves as having nonviolent means by which to maintain or restore their self-esteem and self-respect. Most of us have such means, such as education, knowledge, skills, and achievements that are honored and respected by others and by ourselves, a profession or career, and some standing or status in the community, and with one's family and friends. It is also important not to underestimate the degree to which the self-esteem of many, if not most people, in the very materialist, capitalist culture in which we have all been raised and in which we have to live, is dependent on having whatever minimal degree of wealth or income they need in order to feel that their net worth, in the accountant sense, reinforces their self-worth in the psychological sense. The people who become violent criminals and end up in prison are notably lacking in all of those nonviolent sources of self-esteem. They're overwhelmingly poor, uneducated, many are illiterate, lacking in any skills that they or others could respect, and of the lowest possible social and economic status in society. As the poor, they are lower class, and as members of minority groups, typically, which often means people of color, they are of lower caste, which increases the risk that they will be poor or lower class as well. So when they are shamed, they do not have enough nonviolent internal or external sources of self-esteem with which to compensate. Violence is their last resort in the literal sense that it is their last resource. And that brings us to another category among the multiple, but related, causes of violence. Chapter 2, the social causes of violence. In order to understand the spread of contagious disease so that one can prevent epidemics, it is just as important to know the vector by which the pathogenic organism that causes the disease is spread throughout the population as it is to identify the pathogen itself. In the 19th century, for example, the water supply and the sewer system were discovered to be vectors through which some diseases became epidemic. What is the vector by which shame, the pathogen that causes violence, is spread to its hosts, the people who succumb to the illness of violence? There's a great deal of evidence, which I will summarize here, that shame is spread via the social and economic system. This happens in two ways. The first is through what we might call the vertical division of the population into a hierarchical ranking of upper and lower status groups, chiefly classes, castes, and age groups, but also other means by which people are divided into in-groups and out-groups, the accepted and the rejected, the powerful and the weak, the rich and the poor, the honored and the dishonored. For people are shamed on a systematic, wholesale basis, and their vulnerability to feelings of humiliation is increased when they are assigned an inferior social or economic status. And the more inferior and humble it is, the more frequent and intense the feelings of shame, and the more frequent and intense the acts of violence. The second way is by what we call the horizontal asymmetry of social roles or gender roles to which the two sexes are assigned in patriarchal cultures, one consequence of which is that men are shamed or honored for different and in some respects opposite behavior from that which brings shame or honor to women. That is, men are shamed for not being violent enough, called cowards or even shot as deserters, and are more honored the more violent they are, with medals, promotions, titles, and estates. Violence for men is as successful as a strategy. Women, however, are shamed for being too active and aggressive, called bitches or unfeminine, and honored for being passive and submissive. Violence is much less likely to protect them against shame. Relative poverty and unemployment. The most powerful predictor of the homicide rate in comparisons of the different nations of the world, the different states in the United States, different counties and different cities, and census tracts is the size of the disparities in income and wealth between the rich and the poor. Some 36 studies at least have found statistically significant correlations between the degree of absolute as well as relative poverty and the incidence of homicide. Hasse and Pugh in 1993 did a meta-analysis of 34 such studies and found strong statistical support for these findings, as have several other reviews of this literature. Two on Homicide by Smith and Zahn in 1999, Chasin in 1998, Short in 1997, James in 95, and individual studies such as Braithwaite in 79 and Messner in 1980. On a worldwide basis, the nations with the highest inequities in wealth and income, such as many third world countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, have the highest homicide rates and also the most collective or political violence. Among the developed nations, the United States has the highest inequities in wealth and income and also has by far the highest homicide rate, 5 to 10 times larger than the other first world nations, all of which have the lowest levels of inequity and relative poverty in the world and the lowest homicide rates. Sweden and Japan, for example, have had the lowest degree of inequity in the world in recent years, according to the World Bank's measures. But in fact, all the other countries of Western Europe, including Ireland and the United Kingdom, as well as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, have a much more equal sharing of their collective wealth and income than either the United States or virtually any of the second or third world countries, as well as the lowest murder rates. Those are cross-sectional studies which analyze the populations being studied at one point in time. Longitudinal studies find the same result. Violence rates climb and fall over time as the disparity in income rises and decreases, both in the less violent and the more violent nations. For example, in England and Wales, as figures 1 and 2 show, you'll be able to see the figures. There's an almost perfect fit between the rise in several different measures of the size gap between rich and poor and the number of serious crimes recorded by the police between 1950 and 1990. I'm going to skip that part because I'm not going to show you these diagrams. The increase in crime rates follows the increase in rates of relative poverty almost perfectly. As both inequality and crime accelerated their growth rates simultaneously, the annual increases in crime from one year to the next became larger than the total crime rate had been in the early 1950s. Okay. Same correlation between violence and relative poverty has been found in the United States. The economist James Galbraith, in Created Unequal, 1997, has used inequity in wages as one measure of the size and history of income inequity between the rich and the poor from 1920 to 1992. If we correlate this with fluctuations in the American homicide rate during the same period, we find that both wage inequity and the homicide rate increased sharply in the slump of 1920 to 21 and remained at those historically high levels until the great crash of 1929, when they both jumped again, literally doubling together and suddenly to the highest levels ever observed up to that time. Those record levels of economic inequality, when unemployment increases, were accompanied by epidemic violence. Both murder rates and wage inequity remained twice as high as they'd previously been until the economic leveling effects of Roosevelt's New Deal beginning in 1933 and the Second World War a few years later combined to bring both violence and wage inequity down by the end of the war to the same low levels at the end of the First World War, and they both remained at those low levels for the next quarter of a century from roughly 1944 to 1968. That was the modern turning point. In 1968, the median wage began falling after having risen steadily for the previous 3 decades, and beginning in 1969, inequality started to rise and continued to increase sharply for 15 years. Great, just as I was born. Both wage inequality and homicide rates remained at those relatively high levels for the next quarter of a century. From 73 to 97. That is, the murder rate averaged 5 per 100,000 from 1942 to 66, and 10 per 100,000 from 70 to 97. Finally, by 1998, unemployment dropped to the lowest level since 1970. Both the minimum wage and the median wage began increasing again in real terms for the first time in 30 years, and the poverty rate began dropping. Not surprisingly, the homicide rate also fell for the first time in nearly 30 years, below the range in which it had been fluctuating since 70-71, though both rates of murder and of economic inequality are still higher than they were from the early 1940s to the mid-1960s. As mentioned before, unemployment rates are also relevant to rates of violence. M.H. Brenner found that every 1% rise in the unemployment rate is followed within a year by a 6% rise in the homicide rate, together with similar increases in the rates of suicide, imprisonment, mental hospitalization, infant mortality, and deaths from natural causes such as heart attacks and strokes. And that reference is from Mental Illness and the Economy, 73, and Personal Stability and Economic Security, 97. Theodore Chiricos reviewed 63 American studies and concluded that while the relationship between unemployment and crime may have been inconsistent during the 1960s, it became overwhelmingly positive in the 1970s as unemployment changed from a brief interval between jobs to enduring worklessness. And that is from Rates of Crime and Unemployment, 1987. David Dickinson found an exceptionally close relationship between rates of burglary and unemployment for men under 25 in the UK in the 80s and 90s, Crime and Unemployment, 93. Bernstein and Houston have also found statistically significant correlations between unemployment and crime rates and negative correlations between wages and crime rates in the U.S. between 89 and 98, Crime and Work, 2000. If we compare Galbraith's data with U.S. homicide statistics, we find that the U.S. unemployment rate has moved in the same direction as the homicide rate from 1920 to 92, increasing sharply in 1920 to 21, then jumping to even higher levels from the crash of 29 until Roosevelt's reforms began in 33, at which point the rates of both unemployment and homicide also began to fall, a trend that accelerated further with the advent of the war. Both rates then remained low, with brief fluctuations until 1968, when they began a steady rise, which kept them both at levels higher than they had been in any post-war period, until the last half of 97, when unemployment fell below that range and has continued to decline ever since, followed closely by the murder rate. Why do economic inequality and unemployment both stimulate violence? Ultimately, because both increase feelings of shame. For example, we speak of the poor as the lower classes, who have lower social and economic status, and the rich as the upper classes, who have higher status. But the Latin for lower is inferior. Wow. And the word for the lower classes in Roman law was humiliores. Even in English, the poor are sometimes referred to as the humbler classes. Our language itself tells us that to be poor is to be humiliated and inferior, which makes it more difficult not to feel inferior. The word for upper or higher was superior, which is related to the word for pride, superbia, the opposite of shame. Also, the root of our word superb, another antonym of inferior. And a word for the upper classes in Roman law was the honestiores, related to the word honor, also the opposite of shame and dishonor. Inferiority and superiority are relative concepts, which is why it is relative poverty, not absolute poverty, that exposes people to feelings of inferiority. When everyone is on the same level, there is no shame in being poor. For in those circumstances, the very concept of poverty loses its meaning. Shame is also a function of the gap between one's level of aspiration and one's level of achievement. In a society with extremely rigid caste or class hierarchies, it may not feel so shameful to be poor, since it is a matter of bad luck rather than of any personal failing. Under those conditions, lower social status may be more likely to motivate apathy, fatalism, or passivity, or passive aggressiveness, and to inhibit ambition and the need for achievement. Caste-ridden cultures, however, may have the potential to erupt into violence on a revolutionary or even genocidal scale once they reject the notion that the caste or class one is born into is immutable and replace it with the notion that one has only oneself to blame if one remains poor while others are rich. This we have seen repeatedly in the political and revolutionary violence that has characterized the history of Indonesia, Kampuchea, India, Ceylon, China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, and many other areas throughout Asia during the past half century. All of which is another way of saying that one of the costs people pay for the benefits associated with belief in the American dream, the myth of equal opportunity, because it is a myth, is an increased potential for violence. In fact, the social and economic system of the United States combines almost every characteristic that maximizes shame and hence violence. So, the very structure of society makes the society more violent than most other societies on the face of this earth. At first, there is the Horatio Alger myth that everyone can get rich if they are smart and work hard. Yeah, right. Which means that if they are not rich, they must be stupid or lazy or both. Myth. Not true. Second, we are not only told that we can get rich, we are also stimulated to want to get rich. For the whole economic system of mass production depends on whetting people's appetites to consume the flood of goods that are being produced, hence the flood of advertisements that you cannot get away from. Everything's a commercial, isn't it? Third, the social and economic reality is the opposite of the Horatio Alger myth, since social mobility is actually less likely in the U.S. than in supposedly more rigid social structures of Europe and the UK. Contrary to widely held perceptions, the U.S. offers less economic mobility than other rich countries. In one study, for example, low-wage workers in the U.S. were more likely to remain in the low-wage labor market 5 years longer than workers in Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, all the other countries studied in this analysis. In another study, poor households in the U.S. were less likely to leave poverty from one year to the next than were poor households in Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. All the countries included in the second analysis. And that comes from the State of Working America 2000-2001. Fourth, as they also mentioned, the U.S. has the most unequal income distribution and the highest poverty rates among all the advanced economies in the world. The U.S. tax and benefit system is also one of the least effective in reducing poverty. The net effect of all these features of U.S. society is to maximize the gap between aspiration and attainment, which maximizes the frequency and intensity of feelings of shame, which maximizes the rates of violent crimes. It is difficult not to feel inferior if one is poor when others are rich, especially in a society that equates self-worth with net worth, which is a lie. Because it doesn't matter if you have $0 in your pocket and you have nothing to your name. If you truly believe that you're worth something and that it's not dependent on your income, then you're not going to feel like you're not worthy. But our society tries to make you feel that way, don't they? It is difficult not to feel rejected and worthless if one cannot get or hold a job while others continue to be employed. Of course, most people who lose jobs or income do not commit murders as a result, but there are always some men who are just barely maintaining their self-esteem at minimally tolerable levels even when they do have jobs and incomes. And when large numbers of them lose these sources of self-esteem, the number who explode into homicidal rage increases as measurably, regularly, and predictably as any epidemic does when the balance between pathogenic forces and the immune system is altered. And these are not just statistics. I've seen many individual men who have responded in exactly that way under exactly these circumstances. The term going postal. A man loses his job and he suddenly cannot provide for his family and goes into the former office and shoots the whole thing up. It's an example, a very not very recent example, because the term going postal's been around for a while, but okay. For example, one African-American man was sent to the prison mental hospital I directed in order to have a psych eval before his murder trial. A few months before that, he had had a good job. Then he was laid off at work, but he was so ashamed of this that he concealed the fact from his wife, who was a school teacher, and their children, going off as if to work every morning and returning at the usual time every night. Finally, after 2 or 3 months of this, his wife noticed that he was not bringing in any money. He had to admit the truth, and then his wife fatally said, "What kind of man are you? What kind of man would behave this way?" To prove that he was a man and to undo the feeling of emasculation, he took out his gun and shot his wife and children. Keeping a gun is, of course, also a way that some people reassure themselves that they really are men. What I was struck by, in addition to the tragedy of the whole story, was the intensity of the shame he felt over being unemployed, which led him to go to such lengths to conceal what had happened to him. And this is a huge thing because men in our society are pressured to be the breadwinners, and when they cannot, or if they say they have a record that makes no one want to hire them because of their record, which is basing it, not on an individual's character over time, but on a certain incident, which is just like double jeopardy. If you are judging somebody based on something that they've done in the past in that way, it is essentially double jeopardy. I'm reading. Caste stratification also stimulates violence for the same reasons. The United States, perhaps even more than the other Western democracies, has a caste system that is just as real as that of India, except that it is based on skin color and ethnicity more than on hereditary occupation. The fact that it is a caste system similar to India's is registered by the fact that in my home city, Boston, members of the highest caste are called Boston Brahmins, aka WASPs, or White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The lowest rung on the caste ladder, corresponding to the untouchables or Harijan of India, is occupied by African Americans, Native Americans, and some Hispanic Americans. To be lower caste is to be rejected socially and vocationally by the upper castes and regarded and treated as inferior. For example, whites often move out of neighborhoods when blacks move in. Blacks are the last to be hired and the first to be fired, so that their unemployment rate has remained twice as high as the white rate ever since it began being measured. Black citizens are arrested and publicly humiliated under circumstances in which no white citizen would be. Respectable white authors continue to write books and articles claiming that blacks are intellectually inferior to whites, and so on, ad infinitum. It is not surprising that the constant shaming and attributions of inferiority to which the lower caste groups are subjected would cause members of those groups to feel shamed, insulted, disrespected, disdained, and treated as inferior, because they have been, and because many of their greatest writers and leaders have told us that this is how they feel they have been treated by whites. Nor is it surprising that this in turn would give rise to feelings of resentment, if not rage, nor that the most vulnerable, those who lacked any nonviolent means of restoring their sense of personal dignity, such as educational achievement, success, and social status, might well see violence as the only way of expressing those feelings. And since one of the major disadvantages of lower caste status is lack of equal access to educational and vocational opportunities, it is not surprising that the rates of homicide and other violent crimes among all the lower caste groups mentioned are many times higher year after year than those of the upper caste groups. And one could say, oh yeah, well, people just need to get over it, and a person's evil if they commit this. It has nothing to do with anything else but that. But when you have scientific studies and statistics backing up things like this, it makes it very, very clear how these things come to be and why they are the way they are now. Age discrimination has the same effect, particularly for young males. Throughout the world, the most concrete sources of pride, such as power, wealth, status, and honorific titles and positions, are disproportionately given to older males and denied to younger ones. That is, in virtually every social system in which there are military, religious, governmental, financial, or educational status hierarchies, the higher status positions are disproportionately awarded to those who are older. Sometimes this is even required by law. In the United States, for example, one has to be 25 to become a congressman, 30 to become a senator, and 35 to become president. The lowest incomes are paid to those who are just beginning their careers, whereas the highest are found among those who are older. Of all age groups in the U.S., the highest rates of poverty are found among those under the age of 18, and unemployment rates are higher for young males than for older and middle-aged ones year after year. In fact, ever since the values of Western culture were first codified in the dawn of history in the Ten Commandments, the elderly have been accorded more honor than the young. Thou shalt honor thy father and mother, with not a word about honoring the son or daughter. But the young are not only given less access to the sources of honor and pride, they are also disproportionately subjected to the sources of shame and humiliation. For example, until only a few years ago, the legal systems of every nation permitted adults, parents, babysitters, teachers, etc., to engage in the corporal punishment of children, behavior that would constitute an assault and battery if committed on another adult, such as slapping and hitting, including with sticks, rulers, belts, and other objects. Even today, only 10 nations forbid all corporal punishment, even by parents. The Scandinavian countries, Latvia, Croatia, Austria, Italy, Israel, and Cyprus, and only one state in the U.S., Minnesota, where many are of Scandinavian descent. Although the United Kingdom is less permissive of this practice than the U.S., that it forbids teachers from hitting children, it still permits parents to do so. We know that assaults of this sort are experienced by children as humiliating, because they tell us so, both at the time and in later years. Indeed, the adults who behave in this way are usually quite clear that their aim is to humble the child, and they succeed all too well, though the effect is to teach the child to humble others by insulting them as well. Etymology also teaches us that an assault is experienced emotionally as an insult. The two words come from the same Latin root, and even in English they have overlapping meanings. So even when it does not produce physical injury, the corporal punishment of children conveys a clear symbolic message that children are inferior to adults and are not to be treated with respect, and that it is permissible to hit someone if you happen to be stronger than they are. Okay, I'm going to take a break here. My throat's starting to hurt. But as you can see, these are very strong scientific backed proofs